The shadow that overshadows. That's today's episode of Pocketing God's Promises. Welcome to Pocketing God's Promises, a practical podcast where we consider inspiring stories of missionaries and gospel workers of the past and reflect on timeless truths that still transform our lives today. Whether you're a pastor, parent, missionary, or another believer seeking to live a life of deeper consecration to Christ, this podcast is for you. Join us as we learn from these examples of the past to take God at His Word today. I'm John Crocker.
And I'm Tim Berry. So today I want to tell a story, a very familiar story about the 5 men killed by the Aucas on January 8, 1956. But there's a twist to the story that is largely unknown. So these men were burdened to reach the Aucas. For Jim Elliot, who's kind of the leader of them, his burden is clear even from the very year when he first sailed for Ecuador with Pete Fleming, his friend. And he makes comments even in May of 1952, gave myself for Auca work more definitely than ever. And in that same year, July 1952, he wrote, "Over the Auca's Father, I want to sing." We're going to come back to that toward the end of our story. So he goes to Ecuador. Betty eventually follows him, his wife, Elisabeth Elliot. They don't marry until October of 1953. They begin to be increasingly burdened for the Aucas, who are completely unreached. Really, there's not even a possibility of reaching them except for the flying ability of Nate Saint. He's the one that makes Palm Beach happen. And it's in September of 1955 that Nate Saint and Ed McCauley, one of the 5 men, they're doing a flyover some of this area, and they spot for the first time Auca houses. That's when the excitement builds. Jim walks 4 hours to another village where there's somebody there who knows some basic phrases in the Auca or Waodani language, and he tries to pick up a few phrases. Nate begins to make bucket drops of gifts to the Auca Indians, and this takes place for about 13 weeks. They're dropping these gifts. About 6 weeks into the drops, the Aucas begin giving them gifts back in these bucket drops, and so excitement is building. They feel like, okay, now's the time. Let's go in and reach the Aucas. So they pick out this place that they called Palm Beach and begin preparing to set up a little kind of a place where they can stay for a few hours and try to meet up with the Auca Indians. So January 3, 1956 is when Nate Saint dropped his fellow missionaries on the land bar that they called Palm Beach. And a few days later, on Friday, January 6, 3 Waodani walked out of the jungle. It was a man, an older woman, and a younger woman. The day went well. A friendly visit, the first ever friendly contact with the Auca Indians. Eventually, the man and the younger woman headed off into the jungle. The older woman stayed and slept by the fire and left sometime during the night. You can imagine how excited the missionaries were. There was every indication the visit had gone well. The Aucas understood how friendly they were. The man, whom they nicknamed George, they'd even taken him on a plane ride over his village. Everything seemed great. 2 days later, it's Sunday, January 8. Nate Saint is up in his plane, and he sees a group of Aucas headed for Palm Beach. He radios his wife with delight and says, "Okay, there's Aucas coming. We will be back in touch with you at 4:30 p.m. The men on Palm Beach finish their lunch. They begin to prepare a miniature jungle and a model house. They're going to try to demonstrate to the Aucas how they want them to clear the jungle to make way for an airstrip. And they sing together, "We rest on thee, our shield and our defender." 4:30 p.m. comes and goes, and the radio never lights up. Because a few hours after Nate Saint had radioed his wife, all 5 were dead, speared to death by the Aucas that they loved. Of course, Elisabeth Elliot wrote 2 books about this, one of them called Through Gates of Splendor, the other Shadow of the Almighty. When she wrote those books, the reason why her husband and the 4 others were killed was at that time unknown. The 5 men were essentially speared because of a love twist involving George, they nicknamed George, and the younger woman who had visited them on that Friday. As it turned out, George was Ninkiwi. The younger woman was Gimati. Ninkiwi was a killer, even among his own people. He was a killer. He already had 2 wives, one of whom he had speared when he got upset with her. Now he wants to marry this younger woman, Gimati, who was with the 5 men on that Friday, but her brother, Nampa, who is also a fierce warrior, disapproves. The older woman who had followed them out of the settlement and to where those missionaries were on that Friday morning was acting like a kind of an impromptu chaperone, not wanting to leave them alone. But after they'd spent the day with the missionaries, Ninkiwi, the man, and Gemari, the younger woman, they had left alone and spent the night in the jungle alone, a social no-no. So on Saturday, this is the Saturday between Friday and Sunday, the two meetings with the Aucas met up with these missionaries. On that Saturday, the man who wanted to marry this woman, Ninkiwi, and her brother Nampa begin to argue over her. And tempers flare, and it's obvious one of these two men is going to get speared. Ninkiwi tries to shift the anger from him by telling his own version of what happened during their visit to the missionaries, making it sound like the foreigners wanted to kill him. The older woman who was with him refutes it. She knows this isn't true. All three of them know this isn't true. But there's an older warrior there who's listening to all of this. He knows that killing season is coming. He knows the river is low, and this is when the tribes can cross the river and attack other tribes. He knows this. He knows that his tribe can ill afford to lose Ninkiwi to a spear thrust from Nampa, the brother of this younger woman. So he allows the rage against the missionaries to escalate. It boils over, and the rest of what happens on that Sunday is history. The 5 missionaries are killed, humanly speaking, because of a lying lover who was not getting his way. And this is where the title of Elisabeth Elliot's book comes into play. The shadow of the Almighty. Is God bigger than a love spat? Is his will evaded and his workers killed because of something beyond his control? What Betty Elliot, her husband, and the other 4 killed that day understood and were banking on was Psalm 91:1, that those who make the Almighty their refuge abide under his shadow, and his shadow overshadows all other shadows. In actuality, God used the lying lover to bring about the death of these 5, the 5 who all gladly would give their lives for the Aucas, because an unavenged death is what it would take to reach the Aucas. The Aucas had never seen an unavenged death before, and it was the death of these 5 men and the lack of vengeance on the part of their wives and their families, that's what opened the door for the gospel to reach the Auca Indians. God's shadow overshadowed the shadow of Ninkiwi, Nampa, and Gemari. No evil ultimately befell those 5. The gospel penetrated to the Auca Indians, and Jim, who in July of 1952 had said he would like to sing over the Aucas, has been doing that for about 70 years.
I'll add to that, Tim, just the way that God has used this story, began using this story of these 5 martyrs very soon after their death to actually propel multitudes more into missionary service. I think we've got to include that as part of the way that God's shadow overshadowed all of this. And for us today, we think of these difficulties, these shadows that to us look threatening. We don't understand what is going on in that darkness. But what we don't actually realize is that's not a dark shadow. That's actually God himself moving pieces in ways that we would never have imagined. He's in there. His shadow overshadows those things because he's actually behind it all. And I think this well-known story, as you said at the beginning of the episode today, displays that in such a remarkable and thrilling way that these men and their families, we look at them as having given so much, and they did. And we look at these things that they experienced, even their own martyrdom, as dark, dark shadows. But in reality, it was God. And it was God giving to Jim and the others the desire of their hearts, the salvation of that tribe. And then through that, really ripple effects, even to the ends of the earth, as God has used this story to propel so many others forward. So God's shadow overshadows. That's something we can remember. We need to tuck that truth away. It is true. The one who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. They knew that to be true. They experienced that, and we can live that way. Whenever we see dark shadows, we need to take refuge in the great shadow, the shadow of the Almighty God, and we can move forward with confidence that His shadow actually overshadows all else.
Thank you for listening to Pocketing God's Promises, a podcast of GFA Missions. If we could serve you or help you as you carry out the Great Commission, please visit us at gfamissions.org/pocketing. Until next time, remember to pocket God's promises and take Him at His word today.